Okay, hello, and welcome back to BPM 232, Buddhist Psychology. And this is lecture 10, which is to say the nature of self, part 2. So in the first part, we revisited, right, when we were talking about sort of the nature of self. What's the nature of self? It doesn't exist. It's empty, right? But also pointed out that, having that kind of basic propositional information doesn't really get to the heart of what Buddhism is attempting to do, which is that the practices of Buddhism are intended to try to give you a direct, a perspectival, and a participatory access to those facts that supersedes just being told something. And of course, there are many, cases of this. So we talked about the moon and the water. We talked about sort of the fist, and we talked somewhat about the aspects of this in language, right? That emptiness as a phenomenon was not sort of vacuousness, right? So for phenomena to be empty does not mean for them to be vacuous. It's not that there's nothing there. It's just that there's nothing solid there. There's nothing permanent there. Everything is conditioned. Everything is contingent. Everything is flowing. Everything is changing, right? There are no nouns, only verbs. Okay. And we started to touch on some of the background of Western psychodynamics. Okay, so as a development, which really traces its way historically back quite far, but we find the modern flowering beginning with, properly speaking, Freud. I said this in the other video that I posted, but of course, Freud is very often these days the butt of sort of reductionist jokes. And in some ways, okay, a lot of Freud's particular explanations and theories don't hold up especially well. However, some of the core things which he has contributed to the sort of discourse around the mind are just absolutely invaluable. Like he gets to be in the temple hall of the immortals, if for nothing else, for bringing our attention to the unconscious. So we began to talk about the question of the unconscious, generally speaking, and to discuss the idea that under these sort of psychodynamic theories of the mind is not a unitive thing, right? That it overcomes the unitive bias, the idea that we are singular unitive beings, but rather proposes that we are systems of parts or systems of dynamics that interact together in order to produce what we conventionally think of as our mind. Right? As our mind, as our personality, as our self. And you can see immediately that this is highly consonant with many of the core ideas that we see in Buddhism around the notion of the skandhas, right? The heaps. So that, the heaps themselves, right? You can sort of, break down the basic sense of being into the heaps. The heaps themselves can be decomposed into individual processes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I also mentioned that depending on the particular school or strain of Buddhism that you're looking at, there are numerous ways that people sort of carve up, okay, the notion of the mind in Buddhism. One of the most common ones sort of says that there are 8 consciousnesses, a number of which are associated with each of the senses specifically. But one of them that I mentioned I was going to focus on that's interesting in this respect is the notion of what's called storehouse consciousness. Storehouse consciousness in Buddhism. So the idea of storehouse consciousness, okay, is that you can think of storehouse consciousness as being like a large repository of seeds, okay? A large repository of seeds. And that to the extent that those seeds are, watered or nurtured, right, they're going to grow. The idea is that as you encounter, whatever things that your parents told you, experiences that you had, aspects of your culture, right? These are sort of putting various sorts of seeds into this storehouse, right? And there are certain kinds of seeds that are sort of innate to your experience as a human being. How you water those various seeds, which might be different kinds of thoughts, different kinds of emotions, is going to determine their flowering. So there is a sense, right, in which storehouse consciousness is both the storehouse itself, okay, and the seeds. But those two pieces are not identical. One of the comparisons that is sometimes made around this is to say, like, if you have a basket of apples and you take the apples out, you don't have a basket of apples, right? The apples are not identical to the basket. Nevertheless, you don't have a basket of apples unless you have a basket. with apples in it, right? Seems pretty simple. Similarly, with storehouse consciousness, you have the storehouse, but you also have the seeds. In a sense, those are both part of the kind of system, right? The part of the mind that's being talked about, but they are sort of distinct. There's the storehouse itself, and then there are the individual seeds. Now, what's interesting about this from our perspective is the way in which that is probably the closest thing that we find sort of within, common forms of Buddhism. There are some instances outside, and we may have time to talk about some of the properties of Vajrayana and some of the things that are in Vajrayana and Tibetan Buddhism, etc. But within sort of widespread Buddhism, the notion of storehouse consciousness is kind of the closest thing that we get in Buddhism to the notion of the unconscious within Western psychodynamic theory. That there is a part of your mind that you do not normally have access to, but that contains within it seeds, potentials, sometimes planted by other people and by experiences, and some of them innate. And to the extent that those things sort of receive resources, right, that they are watered or nurtured, you're going to get different kinds of experiences, different flowerings within your personality and expression. So storehouse consciousness is sort of the closest in some sense that we get within this account of Buddhism to getting an idea of the unconscious. Now, I gave you a bunch of sort of commonplace instances where we can see the influence of the unconscious. Obviously, this is something that goes much, much deeper than the examples that I proposed around sort of recovered memories and like lethological tip of the tongue, right? But it's enough to give you an idea that there are a relatively large number of processes which are occurring within your mind, but not within your consciousness, and that there is a somewhat porous boundary. Things move back and forth. Things can be in your consciousness and pass into the unconscious. They can be in the unconscious and pass back into the conscious, okay? Okay. So, as I said, there is a full video already posted up on Jungian psychodynamics, which goes into some more detail following Freud and getting into sort of one of Freud's first kind of followers, one of the people that broke away from him, Carl Jung. As I mentioned, I'm a neo-Jungian, so I'm quite familiar with sort of Jungian theory. But one of the things that is sort of really important that we're discussing from a Jungian perspective, right, or from this perspective, is that within Jungian psychodynamics, you are really like a dynamic system. You are a collection of parts, and your consciousness isn't even the primary one, right? Not by any stretch. It does an important thing, but it's not the center of the system. And although it has important and indeed unique functions, there are other forces and factors within your psyche, right, which possess their own goals, their own methods, their own perspective, and they may or may not be aligned in various ways with your mind. When you are engaged, or sorry, with your conscious mind, when you're engaged in the process of doing sort of depth psychology, right, Jungian work, one of the big things that you are engaged in is attempting to differentiate and recognize the operation of these different parts. So as mentioned in that video, right, there are some sort of conventional terms that we apply to some of this stuff, right? So there is the notion of the shadow, there is the notion of the contrasexual soul image, and there are other notions of sort of archetypes, right? The trickster archetype, the wise old man, the great mother, etc. There are these various kinds of forces which are operating within that can impinge on your regular consciousness in ways that, in fact, consciousness may and may not be aware of. It's possible with training to sort of pick up the influence of these other forces within your psyche. But a lot of the time you're sort of led by the nose by them. They can sort of manipulate you through your complexes, etc. But one of the big moves that people in fact stumble over very often when they're doing this kind of work is just getting over the idea that their identity stops with their consciousness and that their consciousness is unitive. So consciousness is just one part of the system, right? But it's the only part you can see. The comparison that I very often make here is it's like the old joke about, it's not a very good joke in a way, but it's like the old joke about somebody walks by and they can see like a drunk kind of stumbling around looking for their car keys underneath a lamppost in the dark. And they walk up and they say, what are you looking for? And the guy says, oh, I'm looking for my keys. And they say, did you drop them here? And the guy says, no, but this is where the light is good. This is the condition in which many people who are engaged in sort of depth work in psychodynamics find themselves, right? They keep looking inside the conscious frame to see, what the issue is, when in fact they need to be sort of making inferences about what's happening outside that frame in the wider unconscious. Now, there are important differences, okay, between psychodynamics as we're discussing it here and Buddhist notions. I don't want to claim that they are identical, but they share some very important similarities. In no small part, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about depth psychological work with Jungian theory, one needs to expand their identification of what they are to include this entire system, right? As though you stop identifying with the Earth and you learn how to identify with the whole solar system, okay? In which the Earth is just one part and not even the center. Okay. And learning to do that is going to bring you to a position where you are in closer communication with some of these other parts, okay, and where you're in closer alignment with some of these parts. That is sort of the basic idea. I'm simplifying it enormously, but that is in some ways the basic idea. Similarly, right, one, as they are pursuing sort of Buddhist insight, is attempting to break down the unitive bias. So it's the same in both cases. You need to overcome this unitive bias, the idea that we are singular unitive beings. And as long as you're sort of hung up on the notion that you are a singular unitive being, lots of things become incredibly difficult to deal with and explain. And often cognitive dissonance kicks in, and you'll tend to sort of sideline things or blame other people, right? It becomes very difficult to understand what's happening because you're extremely fixated on the idea that you are one being and you're really real and you're in control. And when you loosen that up and you start to realize that there are a whole host of forces that are all influencing each other and they compose you in some important sense, that can be disorienting, right? It can be existentially disorienting because it's not what we're used to, but it's also, as I'm going to propose, considerably closer to the actual truth of the matter, right? Okay. We're going to talk more about storehouse consciousness a little later, but I mean, it's an interesting subject. You can very easily kind of look into it if you want to look into it. The core thing that I wanted to get at is that it is reflective in some ways of this concept of the unconscious. And there are a number of things that we might think of as sort of gaps in a way within Buddhist psychology. For instance, Buddhist psychology does not, such as we're discussing it, does not generally have a very nuanced account of emotion, curiously enough, right? It has an account of sort of craving, etc., but its notion of emotion is not especially nuanced, right? And so that's frankly something that we can sort of borrow and import when we're thinking about this in terms of integration with Western modes. Likewise, the concept of the unconscious and the sort of dynamics involved, it's going to be different between these two systems. But nevertheless, there is a kind of utility, okay, to the Western conceptions around the unconscious and around psychodynamics that frankly can often bring a lot of clarity to conceptions, because frankly, people in the West often find it quite difficult to penetrate the sort of very fine-grained distinctions that we see within various Buddhist systems for breaking this stuff down. So figuring out points of correspondence, like storehouse consciousness to the unconscious or the collective unconscious, makes for sort of an important piece of bridging that can help clarify things. Okay, now, why do I keep saying that the unitive bias is not particularly well supported within sort of science and cognitive science? Okay, so I want to cover this sort of in brief, but what I want to get at is that the more we've learned about the specific functioning of the brain, the less evidence we have found for the idea that there is such a thing as singular unitive being. It simply isn't what we find. So let me give a few examples, and then we'll talk a little bit about general theory, okay? So in terms of a few examples, one of the most interesting early examples that we find of this comes about through cases of epileptic seizure. So there were sort of cases in the 1970s where people had quite serious epileptic seizure. And epileptic seizure, particularly sort of temporal lobe seizure, temporal lobe epilepsy, is a condition where people effectively have like an out of control electrical storm that propagates through their brain. So an area starts firing and that creates electrical impulses that fire uncontrollably through their brain, and that can disrupt their regular state of consciousness. And if you've ever seen somebody have an epileptic seizure, they sort of go into a state of spasm, seizure, jerking. My father is an epileptic, so I'm somewhat familiar with this. And I've had a few epileptics as students, so I've sort of been on site when people have had seizures of this kind. So in the 70s, there was a proposal for one of the ways that they might be able to intervene to prevent this. And the idea was that because in certain patients, this sort of storm of electrical activity was propagating from one side, one hemisphere of the brain to the other and taking it over, that they might be able to prevent seizure by simply severing the band of tissue that connected the two hemispheres together. So this band that connects the two hemispheres together is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum, and it's not just like a ribbon of glue. It is in fact a very dense set of connections between the two hemispheres. But the idea was that if they could sever that particular system, then they might be able to stop right hemispheric electrical activity from propagating to the left and help people deal with their seizures. So this was a surgical intervention. They severed the corpus callosum. Now, there were a few things that were somewhat striking as soon as they did this. It did indeed very often treat seizures. So the seizure activity dropped considerably, and that was obviously important from a medical perspective. But the other thing was that they expected that there would be a more significant impact on people's functioning than there actually was. They finished this, and you think about that, that's a pretty serious intervention into brain structure. Like you're cutting somebody's brain in half. And yet people seemed to retain a substantial amount of functionality. They didn't seem, there were some effects, but they didn't seem seriously affected until they looked closer. Because what happened, what they discovered in the 70s, was that in a sense, by severing the two hemispheres in this way, by severing the corpus callosum, they had created, in a sense, two independent centers of consciousness, seemingly. So people were largely localized in their left hemisphere, okay? But their right hemisphere was no longer tightly integrated. Now, there were still connections between the systems because they could connect through lower level systems, but they didn't have this sort of rapid access connection of the corpus callosum. And all kinds of interesting effects emerged from that. So one of the most common effects that occurs in it is something that is called, originally found in France, called alien hand syndrome. And in alien hand syndrome, the right hemisphere is sort of no longer on the same page as the left hemisphere, and therefore the left arm, because you get crossover, the left hemisphere controls the right half of your body and the right hemisphere controls the left half, crossover for reasons that are frankly obscure to me. But anyway, because the right half of their hemisphere was no longer integrated with the left half and their sense of self was largely localized to their left half, their left arm would suddenly start doing things by itself. So for instance, there is an interesting example. There's an interview where a woman talks about how it started unbuttoning her shirt for her and she had to kind of stop it. She would go to light a cigarette and it would knock it out of her hand. She would go to open a cupboard and it would close the cupboard. And sometimes the hand will strike people or otherwise do things, right? It's as though the hand has a mind of its own. Now, when you take people who've had their corpus callosum severed, so-called split brains, and you put them in the lab, it turns out that there are all kinds of interesting things that you can get from this. If you put a divider basically on their nose, you can give separate information to each of their eyes. And you can do things like ask them a question and get them to write down the answer and say the answer, and they'll do two different things. So their left and the right hemisphere giving two separate answers, right? there's a lot of interesting examples of this. If you Google split brain, right, YouTube split brain, you can find sort of countless interesting videos. One of them, as I recall, is hosted by John Cleese of Monty Python, which is sort of a weird choice, but entertaining. The point is, right, what researchers, primary amongst them, a guy named Michael Gazzaniga, what they eventually had to conclude was that there was in fact a separate sense of self in the right hemisphere. But there was sort of a primary sense of personality or self in the left, but a separate sense of self in the right. Now, since the 1970s, we've refined our notion of what is happening processing-wise between the left and right hemisphere, okay? So you may have heard sort of ideas that like the left hemisphere is the logical, mathematical hemisphere, and the right hemisphere is the artistic hemisphere, or whatever. That is not quite right. But it is true that there are different sets of functions between the two, and that sort of language and consciousness, sort of self-identity for most people is localized on the left side, right? I believe that's different for left-handed people, which is about 10% of the population, but for most people, right, it's sort of localized in this way. But that doesn't mean that there is sort of no consciousness on the right side. It just means that normally the left and the right are in tight integration. So they express themselves as though they're a single consciousness. But as soon as you cut that connection, it's not like the right side suddenly winks out and there's nothing there. It retains its own separated awareness and stuff. And if you think about like what is required for an arm to like lunge out and do stuff, to undo buttons, to, you know, close a cupboard, to whatever, like it has to be able to process information in a particular way and take action. This is not unintelligent action. It's not random movement, right? There's a thing in there, right? In a sense, a personality in there, which is seeing things and making decisions about it. As this woman puts it with smoking, she's like, it really doesn't like when I smoke. So her arm independently will try to stop her from doing so. Okay, so think about that idea for a second, because, you know, one of the core things that kind of came out of split brain was the notion that it's not the case that cutting the corpus callosum suddenly magically produces two consciousnesses. It's that there are already two operating systems, but if they are tightly enough integrated in terms of information, then they sort of present as one. They run together smoothly, right? Like, you know, with an old school film projector, right? An old school film projector shows 24 frames a second, where, you know, everything's digital now, but 24 frames a second, where each frame is like a little transparent slide, right? It's a series of still images. But if you present them quickly enough, they appear to be a continuously moving image, 24 frames a second. The same idea is essentially true here. In fact, there are separate processes, but because they're integrated quickly, we perceive them as having a smooth continuity. We perceive them as having a smooth continuity. Okay, so thing one, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. Now, there are a number of sort of interesting discoveries that have emerged from this in various ways that reveal that the relationship between sort of consciousness and different areas of the brain is not nearly as clear-cut as people would tend to think. And I can't get into this in all the detail that I might like. I, in fact, teach an entire half course on this. So if you're deeply interested in this subject, I would encourage you to take New 303, Hypotheses of the Unconscious. There's my unashamed pitch. However, there are a few other things we can look at. So one of this is sort of the neurological attempt to locate the center of consciousness in the brain. So there have been lots of attempts to try to figure out where in the brain consciousness is. Now, we'll get to in a second why, philosophically speaking, that's kind of a nonsense idea. But the point is, we have spent lots of time looking and trying to find the area of the brain. Now, a lot of this has to do with a particular view of brain function that had been dominant for a long time. It's kind of starting to fade, but had dominant for a long time, called functional localization. Okay, so if you've ever looked in a Psych 100 textbook, you've probably seen an old school picture of the brain where it's divided up like a map with areas of different colors and labels attached to it, right? And so here is the piece that does language processing, and here is the piece that does vision, and here is the piece that does, right? This idea that you can sort of label the brain like a map, especially the neocortex, right, the newest area of the brain in evolutionary terms. The idea that you can label it like a map and that if you can draw a little line around the country, that is the area that does that processing is sort of true. It's true that certain functions typically locate in certain areas, and that if you, say, see a brain injury in that area, right, you're going to tend to have an inhibition of that function, okay? However, functional localization has not, science has not been that kind to functional localization, okay? So for a few reasons. One, it's become increasingly clear that the brain changes itself much more than people used to think. So the brain is capable of remarkable acts of healing, but it's also kind of a shape changer, okay? So this is a notion called neuroplasticity. The brain can change its shape, essentially speaking, and considerably more than people used to think. So in cases where people, say, have had a pretty serious brain injury, if it happens to them early enough, right, the rest of their brain can just sort of repurpose areas to do those tasks, right? It's not as fixed as we used to think. Furthermore, okay, it seems to be the case that different brain areas can actually handle multiple tasks at once. So this idea of, the map where you can draw a line around something has largely broken down, okay? I'm not going to get into depth. This isn't a neuroscience course, but the point is this idea of functional localization has fallen away. Nevertheless, it's still the case that we often sometimes look inside the brain and we try to find the country that is, right, the country that is consciousness, right? As though we're going to locate Liechtenstein in the mountains, and there it is, that's consciousness, okay? And that hasn't been the case. There have been a bunch of instances where people have proposed an area of the brain that is supposed to be central to consciousness. There it is, that's the area of the brain. Except then we often find that there is an individual or multiple individuals who have a particular kind of brain injury or brain illness where that area is either badly impaired or absent, but they still have consciousness. And this has, in some cases, been quite dramatic. So there is an illness called hydrocephaly, and hydrocephalics suffer a sort of degenerative breakdown of their brain tissue. Essentially speaking, their brain tissue breaks down and is replaced by sort of pockets of cerebrospinal fluid. In some cases of sort of advanced hydrocephalic degeneration, up to 80% of neocortical mass can be gone. And yet people continue to function almost normally. Now, this totally throws off the idea of functional localization. It's like the brain has just managed to somehow do most of the work, but with only 20% of the brain. And that kind of throws us. If you were to take 20% of the parts out of your car, I guarantee you it would not drive. I shouldn't say that. That seems like a challenge. If you were to take 20% of the parts out of your computer, probably it would not work very well, right? And yet somehow it's the case that we can remove 20% of the parts from the brain, and yet it still does most of the things quite well, right? That's somewhat remarkable. But further, we've seen numerous cases where people have specifically, either through surgery or injury, right, had parts of their brain simply removed that seem like they're supposed to be integral to consciousness, and yet they still have consciousness. Now, this is something of a conundrum. Consciousness is as yet, unexplained. And there are a number of areas that are implicated in consciousness. They appear to play an important role in it. But the point is, it doesn't seem to be a single thing that you can point at, a single area. It seems to be an emergent effect of a bunch of areas interacting with each other, a distributed network effect of areas interacting with each other, okay? Now, very briefly, philosophically, we maybe should have predicted this, because if you think about, a potential theory for how you might explain, say, consciousness within the mind, many of the theories that have been proposed, if they're pointing at a specific area, suffer from a problem, which is that they are homuncular. What this means basically is that you're explaining how the brain works by proposing a little man that lives in it. So you see this even in relatively mainstream psychological theories. So if you are familiar with the theory of working memory, you'll know that it's proposed that working memory has a series of parts, right? The visuospatial sketchpad, the phonological loop, et cetera, et cetera. But one of those parts is the executive, right? Executive control. No, executive functioning. It's like executive control, that sounds wrong. Executive functioning. Okay, and what is executive functioning? Well, executive functioning is the decider. It's the piece that decides stuff. That isn't an explanation. If what you've done is, if your explanation is there is a thing in there that makes the decisions, you haven't actually explained anything. You have to have something that is beneath that level to explain the thing, right? So think about it again. If your explanation for a thing is, oh yeah, there's something in there that does it, that isn't an explanation, not in sort of, regular scientific terms that we would think of. It's not an explanation. So if what you do is point and you say, that's the part and it does the thing. Well, how does it do the thing? I don't know. Maybe there's another little man inside that little man. That's not an explanation. So it's an infinite regress problem. It is homuncular, as we say. So in a way, we probably should have predicted that there was no specific brain area that you could point at that's like, there's the consciousness bit. Nevertheless, people kept looking for it. Now, from our perspective, let's consider for a second what that means, okay? What it means is that probably our sense of consciousness, our sense of the mind, our sense of self is dependent on a bunch of areas interacting with each other, but is in fact a highly distributed function, that it isn't a single thing, that it isn't a tiny man. And in a way, that tiny man theory is precisely the same as the theory of self, that is the conventional theory of self. How do I explain what's going on in my mind? Well, it turns out that I have a ghost who lives in my body, right? And it does all the things, including driving my body. That isn't an explanation in a certain sense, right? Likewise, if we look at this level of explanation, we think, okay, there's an interacting series of dynamics which gives rise collectively under, standard conditions, gives rise collectively to the sense of me. Lots of different things are interacting, and collectively, right, they give rise to the sense of me. But only if they are tightly integrated, only if they're integrated enough that they're all operating quickly together and transparently, right? If I cut this band of tissue, the corpus callosum, all of a sudden my sense of self changes considerably and parts of it operate on their own. You can see immediately in talking about this that this is not at all dissimilar from what we're talking about when we talk about the skandhas and we talk about Buddhism. Yes, at first glance, everything seems to be continuous and fluid and unified. But when you look closer at the functioning, right, if you can develop the kind of acuity of mind and acuity of attention to look inwards more closely, you begin to see, oh no, wait a second. These aren't one continuous thing. There are different forces, different dynamics, which are operating and collectively generating. So in this sense, right, sort of cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience, right, are in fact increasingly coming to support this idea that there isn't a singular unified being within our sense of self. The mind is not singular and unified. And in that sense, it's not identical, right, to Buddhist claims, but it's definitely analogous. It's very similar in a lot of ways, right? And the further down we go into sort of doing neuroscience and brain mapping, the more we're finding that it becomes quite tricky to attempt to identify isolated areas that do isolated things. It's a distributed network. Everything works together in a set of dynamics and something emerges from that. So the question then becomes, if that is the case, what would the benefits be potentially, okay, of learning how to recognize that fact about ourselves? Learning how to recognize that the high level kind of emergent sense of unity that we experience is not in fact the case. Are there benefits to doing so? And that sort of brings us into line with, right, the claims of Buddhism, that in fact it claims, yeah, if you can identify this, it actually eliminates a bunch of problems that might otherwise plague you. Okay. So how does Buddhism propose to do this? So this is going to be somewhat introductory. We're going to pick this up at greater length next week. But we've talked somewhat already about systems of Buddhist meditation and Buddhist contemplation. Okay, so we've talked about metta, and we've talked a bit about sort of mindfulness. So I want to talk a little bit, okay, about the sort of specific initial innovation that the Buddha made, basically what he added to meditation, because meditation was not new, as I pointed out. The Buddha, in fact, studied with a bunch of sort of meditative scholars, right, with great teachers, and mastered those techniques. He didn't invent meditation. But what he does do is he sort of introduces a new form of meditation. And it's that specific form of meditation then leads to the insights of Buddhism, but also the practices that underlie Buddhism. These are, in some sense, the key to getting the kind of direct awareness that is needed, right, to develop a true sort of sense of self, a true sense of the nature of the mind, and a true sense of the nature of reality. So we can think about these things as falling into sort of two parts. One is practices of sort of calm and concentration, and the other is a practice of clear seeing and analysis. So on one hand, it's practices of calm and concentration, and on the other, it's clear seeing and analysis. This calm and concentration side is traditionally referred to as shamatha, okay? Whereas the clear seeing and analysis side is called vipassana. It's vipassana that is the innovation, and we'll get to why as we kind of go through it at some length. Okay, so the calm side, as I mentioned, not the Buddha's innovation. Systems to do this existed all over India at the time, and in fact, you can find comparable systems in other parts of the world. But let's look a little bit at the basics of how this works. So when you're looking to train your attention in this initial sense, very often what you're doing is you look to sort of fix your attention upon an object and attempt to hold your attention there. So for instance, a classic version of this would be meditating on a candle flame or meditating on a mantra, okay? The version that you find sort of most commonly in the West around sort of mindfulness is simply meditating on the breath, okay? And this is something that we talked about. So there are definitely other things that go into it, okay, that help aid the practice. So your posture matters because your breathing matters. Your posture matters because it's often useful to feel sort of balanced in a particular kind of way, right? And it's useful to feel rooted in a particular kind of way. These are all sort of surrounding factors that help support it. But ultimately speaking, the practice is about focusing your attention on the breath. So it is the rising and falling of the breath. You're not counting the breaths typically, right? So it's not about counting the breath. It's just kind of in and out. You experience the coolness of the air as it passes into your nostrils. You experience the warmth as it passes out. You experience the expansion and contraction of your chest. And that's it. You just hold your attention there. If something else sweeps in, and it does, if you've ever sat on the meditation pillows for any length of time, as I said, you may get beginner's luck on the first day and be like, sweet, I'm 2 weeks out from enlightenment. But odds are pretty quickly what you start getting is all kinds of intrusions, right? The novelty wears off and everything else starts jumping into your mind. Learning to practice meditation is a really excellent way to remind yourself how little control you actually have over what is coming through your thoughts. You know, if you thought you were in charge of what was happening in your mind, meditation will very rapidly disabuse you of that idea, right? This is why in the traditions it's called monkey mind, because you're trying to focus on your breath, right? And meanwhile, your mind is jumping all over the place like a screeching primate. And, you know, it's doing what it does. It's, you know, thinking about what you're going to have for lunch. It's considering your laundry, the essay you have due, the date you're about to go on, an argument that you had with your parents. And it's just jumping around, a combination of fantasy, memory, rumination, right? With very little control. As you're sitting in practice and focusing on the breath, the idea is that every time that happens, every time it's sort of jumping around, for a while, you're not going to notice, And then you will. And your initial response is going to be basically to like swear at yourself and then try to return to the breath. And generally speaking, you do not want to do that. You want instead to engage in self-compassion. So you just want to very gently, you notice it's like, oh, right, I'm thinking about my laundry list. And you just label it with a verb, thinking, and then you return to the breath. Now, the mindfulness aspect is not, as has been noted, the kind of emptiness state that you're moving towards, right? Where you are just focusing on the breath and your head isn't thrumming with thoughts and feelings and memories and so on and so forth. It's not about that emptiness. The mindfulness part of this practice is the catching. It's the noticing when you've gone off track and returning. Now, I can't remember if I did the puppy thing for this class. Did I do this? I might have. Okay, well, I'll just recap it quickly anyway. This practice of catching your mind when it goes off base and sort of returning to the breath is in some ways a lot like, house training a puppy, right? So when you get a puppy, you bring the puppy in your house and, the puppy has no idea that you don't want it to go to the bathroom on your carpet. So what you do is you put newspaper down, right? You put the puppy on the carpet and the puppy doesn't know what you want. So it just wanders off the carpet. Now you have a few options at this point, right? One is you can let the puppy do whatever it wants. And if you do that, you're going to have a problem because you're going to have shit all over your carpet, right? This is not what you want. You don't just want to let the puppy do whatever it wants. But at the other end of things, you can grab a hold of the puppy and shout at the puppy and say, go back on the paper. And what you will succeed in doing is getting the puppy to fear and hate you. The puppy will end up being sort of traumatized, but also the puppy will do things like sneak behind the couch to shit. Like you still probably won't effectively learn what you want it to learn, and it will develop all kinds of other antagonistic behaviors. Rather, you want to befriend the puppy. The puppy goes off the paper and you just gently take the puppy and put it back on the paper. And it goes off the paper and you put it back on the paper. And you put it back on the paper. And, puppies aren't as smart as people for the most part, but eventually it'll figure out what you want. And when the puppy goes to the bathroom on the paper, when it does the thing that you are attempting to guide it to do, you reward it. Oh boy, that's great. And you give it a biscuit, right? And that's how it works. And eventually you transfer that to going outside and all of a sudden you have a dog that doesn't go to the bathroom in the house. Pretty simple. Well, this is the same basic practice that you want to use relative to your mind. You can't let monkey mind just run around and do whatever it wants, right? So you have to try to return it. But the tendency is to approach this with an enormous amount of frustration, right? And it's frustrating because, aside from the fact that you begin to feel sort of powerless and frankly bad at it, you're like, oh my God, I'm a crazy person and I'm never going to learn to do this. And it's quite difficult, right? Nevertheless, you want to befriend, you want to have this friendly attitude. You just catch it and you return. And you remind yourself that the act of mindfulness is the act of catching. It's that act of metacognitive catching, noticing that you're off track and pulling yourself back to the breath. Okay, so that's a very basic form of, practice in terms of focus. But we see that many of these sort of calm focus meditations exist through India, and we see them still presently in Buddhism. So you would see instances of, say, as I mentioned, meditation on a candle flame, or meditation on a symbol, or meditation on the image of a deity. Anything where you're attempting to specifically control your attention and focus it on a particular object. And the progression, in a sense, was traditionally to progress to a state of, in a sense, altered states, mystical states of union called jhanas. Jhanas is the typical sort of English transliteration, jhanas. So the jhanas were like this increasing set of absorptions, okay, where you could begin to, for instance, dissolve away the apparent barrier between yourself and the object that you were focused on, right? So for instance, the candle flame, if you were focused on it, would eventually sort of like expand until it filled your whole mind. And then at a certain point, you would get a dissolution, this after a great deal of practice I had, but you would get a dissolution where you were like, I am the candle flame. The candle flame is me. Like there could be a breakdown in the sort of self-other barrier in some sense, right? And so this state of like increasing mystical absorption, together with a state of reducing the content of the mind, right, could lead to an increasing sort of sense of mystical experience and absorption into things, right? A sense of oneness with the universe, for instance. Now, traditional sort of Hindu practice around this stuff often treated the goal of meditation as being these increased states of absorption, the jhanas, together with mortification. So various kinds of physical mortifications that were imposed on oneself, fasting, right? Poverty, I'm trying to think, well, celibacy, etc., right? Various kinds of physical mortifications, including things being, quite uncomfortable, wearing scratchy clothing, sleeping on rocks, only eating, stinging nettles, this kind of thing. And the notion here is that the ability to tolerate these various sort of mortifications, the ability to tolerate them was itself purifying. So that you were purifying yourself by, in a sense, sort of, I don't know, it seems abusive. I almost said abuse, and that's maybe disrespectful, but you were purifying yourself by engaging in a state of sort of self-mortification, self-denial, right? That the extent to which you could sort of take the punishment, it was purifying, and the extent to which you could go into states of jhanas, absorption, right, was elevating, and the idea was mystical union. So the Buddha tried that, right? He goes and sees a series of teachers, learns their systems, but gets the sense that is not really solving the problem. It's not changing him in a fundamental sense. And he goes and he does the ascetic thing, right? The mortifications. And he tries that for a long time, and then he almost drowns in a river. And when he hauls himself out on the far side, right, he's like, God, I almost drowned. Like, I was basically too weak to swim because I've been eating, 3 grains of rice a day for a year, and so on and so forth. And he's like, this can't be it, right? And I have failed, in fact, to change my fundamental sense of self, my sort of concern about death and loss, et cetera, all the things that he was concerned about when he left his father's palace. And so that's when he, sits down under the Bodhi tree and says, I'm not getting up until I figure this out. So what does he do at this point? And that's where we get to Vipassana. So the fundamental moves, there's 2 moves that the Buddha sort of introduces here. And the fundamental moves that he makes are interesting because they're, in a sense, modifications of these earlier systems, right? So the one is, rather than the ascetic idea that self-mortification, right, is purifying, that your ability to tolerate increasing amounts of self-mortification is itself purifying, the Buddha instead puts a twist on this. And he says, no. The purifying factor is equanimity. And equanimity applies to pain, but it also applies to pleasure. It's just equanimity. The extent to which you experience like sort of a neutral state of non-stickiness, non-attachment, right? No prapancha, no elaboration, right? That is the purifying thing. Equanimity rather than sort of tolerance for sort of mortifying ascetic practice. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that he applies meditative technique in a very specific way, and that's Vipassana. So the difference is that instead of simply taking this sort of laser-like focused attention and directing it into achieving jhanas, into achieving states of absorption, right? He turns it inwards to examine in a microscope-like fashion the processes of his own mind. That's the breakthrough, in a sense, is he's like, well, wait a second. Instead of achieving absorption with external objects or internal objects, what happens if we simply observe the processes of self? And when he does this, he sees in sort of this keen way that these processes are discontinuous, that they aren't a singular unified being. He looks, and everywhere he looks, he doesn't find self. He just finds processes. He finds the skandhas. Things rise, they fall. Sensations rise and fall. Cravings rise and fall. Memories rise and fall. But where is the unity, right, that is supposed to be here, right? Where is the Atman? And he doesn't find it there. And in this moment, he sort of has his breakthrough, that it is in turning this kind of attention inwards, right, that you can have the insight, Vipassana, So in a sense, Vipassana is an outgrowth, okay, of learning these calming and focusing meditations. Now, the calm and the focus matters, okay, on the other side, because it has benefits all its own. In fact, very often when people are sort of interested in meditation, okay, it's that side of things that they're primarily interested in. They want that calm focus because, frankly, lots of these states feel great, right? They feel really terrific. Entering mystical states of merger where you're, right, emptying yourself out, actually, it feels pretty awesome. You're very calm, right? So calm, so tranquil. But that also represents, in a sense, a kind of trap. A lot of the time you see, in fact, when people are engaged in practice, that one of the problems that they will sometimes have is that they'll, in a sense, get kind of hooked on the good. They'll get hooked on the calm and the focus. And they'll hit, to borrow a scientific term, a local maxima, right? So they'll get to the top of this hill, the calm and focus hill. But as such, they never go through the valley that would get to them to the much better hill. In order to do that, right, you have to sort of leave behind the feel-good aspect of it and take that skill that you've developed, the attentional skill, and turn it on your own processes. And then you start to have insights, right? So those things might range from trivial insights. You might start to notice as you pay much, much closer attention to your body and your mental processes, you might start to notice just funny little associations. So let me give you an example. Right. So when I was engaged in meditation quite regularly, at one point, it's never quite left me. At one point, I noticed that anytime I was thinking about a particular subject, right? Anytime I was thinking about this particular subject, it was a mathematical subject, I would also simultaneously be imagining a particular corner, the sidewalk of a particular corner of a small town in Ontario called Port Dover that I used to go to for the summer. Now, that's presumably a relatively trivial link in a sense, but it was this kind of connection that, that I began to notice, that I would pick up these like linkages, right, in my mind that were not otherwise obvious to me, that I began to notice things that were happening in my mind that I didn't otherwise notice. Practicing meditation gave me a substantially increased awareness of what I think of as sort of sideline and background processes. And I'll add, sort of in the context of operating as a therapist, that stuff has often been invaluable to me. So I notice very often when I'm with a client in therapy that I have sort of multiple simultaneous streams of information. Now, they're not always obvious to me, but I pick them up a lot more often than I used to. So I will notice sort of images sort of floating up in the background, or snatches of music, or ideas and phrases. And very often it's the case that those things are, in some sense, a reflection or a commentary. They bring additional information to me. So they're sort of usefully insightful in that way. And so it's not uncommon if I'm in session with a client, they'll say something and I'll say, the image that's coming to me is this, and I don't even always know why. I'll pitch it out. But more often than not, what I get is the client sort of saying, oh, yeah, that is important because whatever, right? So there is this kind of acuity. Now, that's a minor instance, but it is an insight. And the point is that as you learn to turn this kind of focal attention inwards on yourself, you begin to yield the sorts of insights that begin to reveal the truth of the nature of your mind to you. The more you focus your attention in this direction, the more you can kind of calm and bring yourself down, the more you have to bring this like Vipassana practice to begin to examine the processes of your thought in a detached state of equanimity. And you begin to notice their true nature. And the claim is, once you do that, you begin to notice that there's nothing solid there. There's nothing solid there. It's just processes, rising and falling processes, interacting processes, no center, no middle, no essence. That's the claim. Now, obviously, on one level, it is that simple. On one level, it's exactly that simple, right? And indeed, if you sort of read into it, you find out that technically you don't even need to do this like calming and focusing meditation. There is a a certain amount of difference, individual difference between people in terms of how they approach this material, right? So some people are going to be really attracted to the calm and focus side, and for other people, that's going to be harder for them to approach. And that doesn't mean that the path is closed to them. In fact, there are some advantages to Vipassana. So when you're learning the calm and focus side of things, frankly, you need like a quiet space, stretches of uninterrupted time, right? Like there are certain things, certain kinds of conditions you have to have. Vipassana, on the other hand, is something that you can technically engage regardless of what you're doing. You can always be examining your processes and examining the processes of your perception and your meditation and etc. If you sort of engage in Vipassana without first engaging in Shamatha, it turns out that this is called dry Vipassana, which makes it sound rough and uncomfortable. And I'm sure to some extent it is. But dry Vipassana. And the idea here is like, yeah, you're not sort of easing yourself in with these powers of calm and concentration, which would allow you to sort of increase this ability. You're just like in a raw sense looking at analytical process. In a way, I might claim that dry Vipassana is essentially speaking what happens in psychodynamic analysis to a great extent. There's a little bit of common containment that's provided by the analyst or the therapist, but you're not typically like first practicing modes of concentration. You're just beginning to do this kind of analysis and breakdown of inner states, right? To try to break it down, pull it apart, figure it out. So dry Vipassana. So in theory, you can practice Vipassana, whatever, you could do it while you're doing sports, you could do it while you're in a conversation, you could do it while you're walking someplace, like any time you can turn your attention inwards. Now, in that sense, it's relatively simple. You do these two things, you do Vipassana, you get fundamental insights into the nature of cognition, boom, you're done. That's it. Then it dissolves away. Once you really fundamentally grasp it, it dissolves away, and that's it. You've solved the problem. Okay, so then in that case, why the rest of all of this stuff? And the answer is that most of these things, most of the other practices and techniques, right? The Eightfold Path, the various sort of moral precepts, right? The whole notion of Sangha, the various teachings, all these things are meant to be there to be sort of supplementary and guidance. They're meant to support the practice in various ways, but also to give you some clear guidance as to what it is that you're experiencing. Because odds are when you experience it, it's going to be weird. I mean, if you've ever had an altered state really of any kind, right, that's serious, it's pretty weird if you don't know what's happening. And it's possible, of course, to experience states in meditation and in Vipassana that are like deeply strange and disorienting. You have to learn in some sense to set aside some of the really like special effects style weirdness. So when I was sitting on the cushion originally, I would get all kinds of strange stuff, flashes of light, sensations of floating, the feeling that my body was expanding or shrinking. All that stuff is detailed within the text, right? It's to be expected. And the point is, all of it is a distraction. It's very easy to look at those things and think to yourself, oh boy, like I'm developing superpowers or something. And you can get caught with, extremely vivid sort of mental imagery, and like all kinds of unusual things can happen as you're examining this. And the idea is that, properly speaking, you should just calm yourself and return to the breath and continue to look at what's happening. However, it is useful, obviously, to set up a framework in which these various things operate. And so we have the Eightfold Path. If you have certain teachings to go by, if you have moral precepts that make it easier for you to access this. So let's take, for instance, nonviolence. Buddhism is pretty famously nonviolent, with some historical exceptions that we'll talk a little bit about. Is that next week? Yeah, that's next week. We'll talk a little bit about. But, by and large, it's nonviolent. And part of the reason for this is that there's a recognition, okay, that doing violence to somebody else relies on an illusion. And the illusion is an illusion of separateness. If you believe that you are separate from another person and that you're in competition, that you are a self and they're a different self and you're trying to get one up on them, then, violence is possible. But like, imagine if you have done violence, and most of us have at some level, We may not have done violence to another human being physically, but probably we've done violence emotionally. And maybe we haven't done violence directly emotionally, but we've done violence to somebody else socially. And maybe we haven't done violence to another person, but we have done violence to another being, right? We've eaten an animal, or we crushed a spider, you know? Like, we've probably done violence at some level. So, you know, the sort of acceptance of violence in some sense requires that sense of separateness. Imagine if that fell away for a second and all of a sudden we realized, oh, there is no self, there is no other, there is just a unity of being. All I did was hurt myself, right? Which is a thing that you get Buddhists saying quite often, right? As part of the recognition. It's like, no, you don't understand. This is part of the understanding of, say, karma in that conception. Is like it comes back to you because there is no you and there is no them. There's no separateness, right? Once you actually get through to it, you realize that doing harm outside is just doing harm inside. But if you've already done a bunch of harm outside, you have a vested emotional interest in not having that recognition, right? The self, such as it is going to protect itself. And so many of these rules are in place basically to get some of the barriers out of the way that would prevent you from having this sort of direct access. And that brings us to one other aspect of meditation, which I've touched on previously, which is metta. Okay, so metta is an expanding contemplative form of meditation in which you have expanding circles of loving kindness, right? Of compassion. So you have expanding circles of compassion, and you extend that to your loved ones, and then you expand it to people who are neutral to you, and then you expand it to your enemies or people who are mad at you or whatever, and you expand it until you include, you know, all people or all sentient beings or all beings, period, right? The entire universe. And the idea is you are supposed to be really earnestly extending this, like, I wish you health and well-being. Like, I wish you health and well-being. Like, I'm wishing that for you, despite the fact that I'm angry at you, or despite the fact that you're angry at me, or despite the fact that you hurt me, or whatever. It doesn't matter. I wish everybody well, right? And to really feel it, to mean it in this expansive sense. So there's some question about the relationship in this context. Like, okay, so there's that. And then there are things that we've spoken about in terms of self-compassion. And what's the relationship between these things? So when we're talking about this, right, outwards extended compassion and self-compassion, right, and the sort of transformative aspects of self-compassion, why does this matter? Well, the answer is that the standpoint that Buddhism claims you get to if you engage in this practice is a standpoint where you dissolve the barrier between self and other in some important sense, because the self is illusory and their self is also illusory. You're just both processes occurring within a larger process, and you're deeply interconnected and contingent. Hurting them is hurting yourself. Showing compassion to them is showing compassion to yourself. And showing compassion to yourself is showing compassion to them. There is a reciprocal quality to compassion outwards and self-compassion. Now, most people will find it easier to do one or the other, right? Most people will find it easier to show compassion to others, but they're very harsh with themselves, or they're able to give themselves compassion, but not so much other people. It's important to do both, even though ultimately speaking, there is no both. There's just one thing: compassion, radiant compassion, which includes yourself. So this is part of the reason why, you know, as an exercise, we're talking about self-compassion and self-care, because it's an integral component to, right, trying to get an expansive sense of continuity. It feeds into the whole thing, because once you realize that sort of we're all within this, in a sense, boundaryless swirl of dynamic, flexing Buddha nature, right? And that our individuality, the thing that keeps us locked away, is just a barrier that we've set in place, right? That we can sort of render transparent, maybe use as a tool. Like, I don't want to forget my name. You know, my ego consciousness in that sense does some useful things. I don't think you actually want to obliterate it, but you maybe do want to relativize it, have it not take itself quite so seriously. And a big part of this is like being kind to yourself and being kind to others, offering that compassion, that loving kindness, that sense of well-being. In some sense, it's the opposite of the prohibition against violence. By doing this, you're making it much easier, right? When you love, you draw close to in understanding and unity with something, right? There's a sense in which you can't really understand something unless you love it, right? A fact that I think, frankly, is often lost at the academic level. You can't really understand something unless you love it. Which means that people that have a burning hatred on for certain subjects probably don't get it at some level. That would be my claim. So the same thing goes, insofar as you are engaged in self-compassion and you're engaged in outwards compassion, this is a reciprocal practice, because ultimately there is a dissolution between those two things that simply yields compassion. Okay, last thing, because this one's already going kind of long and I don't want to keep people over long. So the last thing that I said I would talk about, and we're going to expand a bunch of this stuff. We're going to talk more about technique and get into some of the specific jhanas, because I'm fascinated by that stuff. We'll talk about a bunch of that next week. But one other thing that I wanted to talk about was, I said that I would touch on some sort of additional evidence, okay, that has emerged from neuroscience specifically, and that is somewhat related to the states that Buddhism describes while not being identical to them. So, you know, we're talking here effectively about, in some ways, enlightenment, right? And that's a dicey term. People feel weird about talking about it and so on and so forth. I think that's unnecessary. I think Buddhism is making a very specific claim about a very specific set of mental states that it is possible for human beings to attain, period. And if that's not true, it's not clear actually what's happening. And so, you know, one of the questions we need to ask, right, when we're coming at this from the integrative Western perspective is to say, okay, so do we see anything like this? Like, is it completely unique, or do we see things like it? Okay, so the first one that I want to talk about is, I think, a really interesting case. And I want to be clear, none of the things that I'm going to describe here are enlightenment. That's not the claim that I'm making. The claim that I'm making here is that what they are is interesting examples where somehow changing the operation of the brain in one way or another, often through injury or illness, yields a state that seems to contain within it an aspect or a facet or a component of what we're talking about. And see, that makes it plausible that such a thing exists. If we find a fragment here and we find a fragment here and we find a fragment here, maybe it's a real thing, basically. So that's kind of what I'm getting. I'm not claiming any of these states are enlightenment. What I'm claiming is that they point in a certain direction. They point towards the possibility that maybe these states that are being described within the Buddhist texts are a thing, that they, in fact, are actual states that can exist in the human mind. That's kind of an open question for people. Some people simply disbelieve in that stuff. Okay, so an example. So when I lived at home, when I lived with my mom as a teenager, we had a next door neighbor who, he was an older fellow. He was in a wheelchair, and he was not a very nice man. He had a real temper, and he was kind of, I don't know, irascible, curmudgeonly, difficult. So between my mother's property and his property, there was this hedge. And he didn't like the hedge. My mom liked the hedge, but he didn't like the hedge. And so he was always sort of, you know, talking to her. She's like, you need to remove this hedge. You need to cut down this hedge. And she's like, I like the hedge. Like, it's on my property. So what's the issue? Anyway, so periodically he would be out there when he thought nobody else was out there, and he would be gradually trimming the hedge. So he'd be taking a pair of trimmers, snip, 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 and working his way down along the side and trimming the hedge. And I knew that my mother had sort of had a confrontation with this fellow where she had been like, don't cut my hedge. And this guy would be out there cutting the hedge, and he would get quite sort of angry about the whole thing. I don't know what his beef was with the hedge. Anyway, so one day I was home, and I was probably reading, having a cup of coffee, listening to music. Since I was like 17, that sounds plausible. And I noted that he was cutting the hedge. And so I went outside and I said, sorry, excuse me, I think you're not supposed to be doing that. Like, I think my mom mentioned to you that you shouldn't be cutting the hedge. And he sort of blew up at me and was like, it's not your house and it's not your business. And anyway, I won't get into the full details here, but I became angry. And I was sort of angry that he was sort of disrespecting my mom's property. And I was angry that he was being so weirdly persistent about this thing that didn't seem like it was that big of a deal. And so, I yelled at him considerably, which is not something I do a lot. I'm not generally a person who loses their temper. I'm not much of a yeller, period. So anyway, I yelled at him. Needless to say, we were not on good terms. Guy gave me the kind of evil eye every time I walked by. I didn't much care for him. Until about a year later, because he had a stroke. So, he had a temporary blockage of a brain vessel, right? And effectively speaking, he saw stroke-related temporary brain damage. Now, I don't want to say that that's not a good thing generally to have a stroke. But the thing that really struck me about the stroke was that afterwards, he had a really sweet personality. So before the stroke, he was extremely curmudgeonly, difficult, irascible, right? Like confrontational, etc. After the stroke, his personality was completely different, and frankly, much more pleasant. So he would wheel over the sidewalk and wheel up to the front porch, and then he and I would talk for like an hour, and he would ask questions and I would ask him questions. He would talk about stuff. Like he just became a different person in some sense. And he became a different person because he had a stroke, effectively because he had brain damage. Like there was some part of his brain that up to that point was operating to make him, frankly, a pretty nasty and difficult person in a lot of ways, which got, impaired, removed, destroyed. And when that happened, he turned into a much nicer and friendlier person. Now, at the time, this really, really struck me. And then interestingly, I saw it happen again. So my stepmother's mother had been, for most of her life, I think, a very anxious person. She was very anxious. So she was like a worrier, very tight-fisted, kind of finicky a little bit. So very everything in its place. And right, she had a lot of anxiety. She was not, let's say, very flow oriented, and she didn't seem to have a lot of pleasure, a lot of fun. Like she didn't loosen up. She was very tightly wound. Okay. And likewise, when she got quite a bit older, at one point she had a stroke. It's not uncommon. And I remember hearing from my stepmother when she went to visit her mother in the hospital. And at one point, this old fellow wandered down the hallway, and the back of his gown was untied. The back of his gown, he only had one gown on, and the back of his gown was untied. So like you could see his naked backside and his butt. And my stepmother's mother absolutely lost it, like cackling, like laughing and laughing that she could see this old guy's ass walking down the hall. Now, it's hard to describe if you didn't know her, but this would have been inconceivable prior to that. Her personality was just set in such a way that the idea that she would laugh, she would have been quite concerned and upset, and like that would have really bothered her before. But instead, all of a sudden, she had this opening up. She found it funny. And I mean, it is kind of funny. Aren't butts funny? They're funny. It was a funny circumstance, and she laughed. It wasn't irrational at all. I mean, it was irrational, but like it wasn't bizarre or out of keeping. It was a somewhat naturalized reaction. And likewise, in general, she had an improved sense of humor. She was much more sort of open, happy, whatever. Again, it seemed like there was an instance where she had this stroke and something was removed. Okay. And what was left, in a sense, was a happier person, more engaged, more fluid, less this. Now, those two instances were really striking to me. There's an interesting book in this vein by Jill Bolt Taylor called My Stroke of Insight. And let's be clear here. I'm not advocating like having strokes as a method of achieving enlightenment. I'm simply pointing out that there are these cases where it seems like, in a sense, damage, removing something, can improve certain kinds of sort of functionality and engagement and flow. So this book by Jill Bolt Taylor, My Stroke of Insight, she's a neuroscientist, and essentially the book is like it's a kind of memoir where she's describing when she had a stroke. And she had a very serious stroke. And if you read the book, which I recommend, even if you just read excerpts of it, she describes at some length basically hitting a kind of completely novel state of consciousness that she hadn't normally been in. And when you read it, it's remarkably similar in some ways to what is described in certain kinds of mystical experiences and experiences of absorption. Now, there were obvious downsides to this. She had to relearn a lot of conventional things, how to like feed herself and walk and talk and lots of conventional things. But this sort of altered sense of self and the relationship between self and the world and stuff remained. So again, it's a case where it seems as though, damage, somehow removing something, suddenly reveals this state, which in some ways resembles facets of what we're talking about when we talk about the states of, sort of in and around enlightenment. It's interesting, right? Okay, likewise, I'm very interested in a general sense in NIBS, non-invasive brain stimulation technologies. So I've done a bunch of stuff around TDCS, which is transcranial direct current stimulation. And I've also done lots of research and I've had TMS, which is transcranial magnetic stimulation. And way back in the day, I did a lot of work and experimentation around sort of inducing altered states with magnetic fields. And that's a story for another day. That was my first career. What's been really interesting sort of around this field is the way that we have, especially in the more recent sort of experimental paradigms around this, managed to get TMS, which focuses a magnetic field very narrowly in the brain to either activate something or shut something off. We've managed to get this experimentally targeted in such a way between those non-invasive technologies and things like neurofeedback. We've managed to get interventions where we can sort of hit very specific areas of the brain. So an interesting example of this that is sort of fascinating and terrifying in a way, you can read a great article in the Chronicle of Higher Education called The Psychopath Makeover. It's kind of terrifying, and it talks about the origins of psychopathy. And psychopathy, generally speaking, that's not a sort of DSM recognized diagnostic category, but generally it's characterized by a kind of lack of affective empathy. So there's cognitive empathy, but not affective empathy. And so we throw the term psychopath around, but it's relatively specific. And what's interesting is this crew of researchers that the journalist was talking to in England, Sussex maybe? I'd have to double check. Anyway, in England, was looking at the sort of neurological correlates of psychopathy. And so they discovered some interesting stuff, like lots of sort of elite trained soldiers, Navy SEALs and this sort of thing, had the ability to temporarily suppress the function of their amygdala. And the amygdala is the little almond-shaped structure bilaterally within your brain that's often associated, not exclusively with, but definitely with fear, states of fear. So as I said, functional localization, you got to be careful about. So it doesn't just do that. It's a little more complicated, but it definitely is implicated in fear states, certain kinds of fear states. And what he discovered was that, or what they discovered rather, was that soldiers who had been trained could sort of turn on a state of artificial psychopathy. And when they did, they would artificially lower the operation of their amygdala, and then they wouldn't experience fear and they wouldn't experience empathy in the same way, They could be kind of cold to do their job because their job ultimately involves, shooting people. What was interesting was they then employed TMS, so transcranial magnetic stimulation, to temporarily suppress that center. And it turned out they can replicate the effects of psychopathy temporarily. And the thing is, when you read this account, I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, go check this article out, The Psychopath Makeover. It's terrifying. And one of the reasons it's terrifying is the description is powerfully seductive. It's a kind of vampire consciousness. The normal angel sitting on the shoulder that sits there and says, you really shouldn't do that, you might hurt people, is just gone. You do things simply because they're gratifying or pleasurable. You don't care about other people, and your performance in a lot of ways goes up. Because think about all the times your little inner voice gets in your way. It's conflicting, right? It stops you, it slows you down. Well, imagine if that was suddenly gone. And this was the state that he experienced. And his account of it, right? He was sort of tested on by the lab. His account of it is fascinating. Now, again, this is an instance of sort of turning off a part of the brain to yield a radical shift in consciousness, which seems to sort of increase ability in some areas, decrease ability in the others. There is an immense clarity that's described by people, right? Because certain kinds of processing and certain kinds of functioning are out of the way. Now, again, I'm not claiming enlightenment is psychopathy, but what I am claiming is that, you know, we have an instance here of something that interrupts the normal flow of fear, and in this case, empathy, and all of a sudden things are different and easier and happier, albeit in a dark way. It's a fascinating article. And, you know, if the general seductiveness of it doesn't scare the crap out of you, I would encourage you to give some thought to how fast we're coming along in the area of cosmetic neuroscience, because we are potentially not that far off from the area where the era where technology will allow us to, in a fairly off-the-shelf commercial way, intervene on our functioning in various ways. You want to be a vampire for the weekend? You just have to buy the Vampire Helmet 2000. That's a terrible name. I really got to take that back to the marketing department. The Vampiro. No, that's awful. Okay, whatever. I'll work on that. Okay, so that's an interesting instance. When you start to go into non-invasive brain stimulation technology, so TDCS and TMS, you find out there are all kinds of these fascinating instances. So with TDCS, there's an interesting experiment from 2011, I believe, where you can apply electrical currents with TDCS, and TDCS is not a complex technology. I have 4 units here in my home. It's not complicated, it's not expensive. Through the simple application of this thing in a certain timing, you can radically increase people's ability to, say, solve insight problems. Now, insight problems are typically, historically, very difficult to solve. Okay, the flash of insight, the eureka, the light bulb going off that's necessary to solve them is sort of spontaneously very low. But you can put this sort of electrical stimulation on somebody's brain, and all of a sudden they get through. And the interesting thing is it's about shifting from one hemisphere to the other and then back, the electrical functioning. And all of a sudden, problems that are people can't kind of figure out, the answer just comes to them. They have insight. So artificially stimulated insight. And when I say like they have insight, the solution rate in some of these problems goes from 0, or very nearly 0 statistically, to 40%. This is a huge jump. It's a huge effect. Likewise, there are stimulation areas that do all kinds of stuff. They can improve people's motor skills. They can improve their ability at math. It's a very effective treatment for depression. And in fact, the treatment for depression is especially interesting because what it seems to do, it doesn't stop the negative feelings rising, but it does increase the functionality of the top-down piece of the brain that can say, no, right? Pause. The bullets are flying towards Neo in the Matrix, and no. So if that stuff isn't suggestive to you, right, go look into it. Part of the claim here that I'm sort of getting into and around is we're starting to discover all of these sorts of technologies, interventions, areas of the brain that seem to, in their individual parts, reflect facets of what we're talking about. We're starting to see something of a convergence here between what we're finding scientifically, cognitive scientifically, neuroscientifically, right? And many of these findings. And they're beginning to converge together towards the possibility that, hey, wait a minute, this might be a really real thing. And furthermore, like, wow, we may be able to assist intervening on this in various ways. And as you can probably tell from my excitement, that's part of my interest here. Right. So there are a variety of other states. I want to make sure I don't keep talking too much longer because I've been going for quite a while. So I'll maybe take up some of these other ones a bit next week. At the intro, we can talk about athymormia, which is an interesting condition where people seem to basically lose their proactive sense of self. So they'll just sit there with sort of emptiness, right? Unless you prime them. If you walk up and talk to them, they can fully answer you and they have their full cognitive faculties. And then when you stop, they just go back. And if you ask them what they've been doing, what have you been thinking about? They're just like, nothing. right? They're just like, they have a kind of emptiness to them, right? Now, again, this generally is as a cause of illness or injury. So I'm not saying it's identical, but right, it's interesting. Likewise, there's sort of interesting work around the temporal lobe. There's interesting work around the anterior insulet cortex. All these different aspects that seem to be reflective in one way or another, okay, of different aspects of the kinds of states that are described within Buddhism and leading up to enlightenment. Okay, so I'm going to stop geeking out. I will elaborate this stuff more later, but there you go. So for this week, we've gone through the nature of the self. It's empty. Through the notion that that is correspondent with psychodynamics, as we talked about in the West, okay, through to some of the stuff about storehouse consciousness and its relationship to the unconscious, okay. We've talked to some extent about the scientific support for the notion of that kind of emptiness, right, of anatta, non-self, which is to say that we're increasingly finding scientifically that we are in fact a pack of dynamics and not unified singular beings. And then we talked a little bit to start with about the procedures which allow the turning inward of vipassana and the examination of one's own processes, which needless to say is a real process, but also maybe we can start amplifying that with technology. Wouldn't it be lovely if you could take a year-long course in meditation and have like a 80% probability of, you know, really getting there? You know, I think this is an exciting idea, but it's something that we will talk about at greater length. Okay, good. So I will see everybody next week, and yeah, we'll be moving into the end zone. There's a bunch of things coming up next week, so I'm looking forward to it. Hope everybody has a good week.